Here's to anyone who's ever looked up. The airheads. And the space cases.
Live long and prosper.
The flight fanatics. The armchair astronauts. And the casually curious. Here's to those who know the thrust in newtons of a Pratt & Whitney J75 turbojet engine. And those who silently ask, what's keeping this thing in the air? Here's to those who can list the name, mission history, and favorite breakfast of every Mercury astronaut. And those who've ever searched for, how does a toilet work in space? Here's to the people who know a P-38 Lightning from a P-51 Mustang. And the people who thought those were the names of cars. Those captivated by the miracle of flight. And those who are just happy to make their flight. So whatever captures your curiosity,
we choose to go to the moon,
or propels you to new heights. When it comes to the sky, there's space for all of us.
Good evening. I'm Chris Brown, and I have the privilege of serving as the John and Adrienne Mars Director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Welcome to tonight's Aviation Adventures Lecture, and thanks so much for joining us. It's great to see everyone gathered here in the Airbus IMAX Theater at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, and we're pleased to make this event accessible to people all across the country through live stream. And by my last count, there's over 500 of you, and the number's growing, joining us online. We appreciate you spending your evening with us. The Aviation Adventures Lecture spotlights all aspects of aviation, from military flight to record-setting feats in the air to the humanitarian uses of aviation. This lecture series is the museum's longest-running sponsored program. This is our 43rd year doing these lectures, still sponsored by our friends at GE Aerospace. I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to GE Aerospace for their ongoing support of this series, which makes it possible for us to provide access to these programs free of charge to audiences both in person and online. Joining us in the audience tonight are Darby Becker and Jackie Furco from GE Aerospace. Please accept our thanks for your generous and enduring support. This fall, our Aviation Adventures lectures are focused on telling the stories and remembering the contributions of trailblazing women in military aviation. I hope you will also join us for our October lecture being held right here at the Udvar-Hazy Center and streaming online on October 10th. That panel discussion will tell stories of sea and air with the U.S. Coast Guard and feature the first 3 black women to break barriers in their field by serving as aviators with the Coast Guard. Free tickets can be reserved on our website. But now, on to tonight's program. Women have wanted to serve their country through military service dating back to the beginning of the United States, and women pilots have wanted to fly for their country since the beginning of military aviation. But the path to equality for women pilots in the military hasn't been a short or straight one. During World War II, women served through various women's auxiliaries, including the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or the WASP as they were more commonly known. But even then, they were classified as civilians. The WASP proved beyond a doubt that women could fly all U.S. Army Air Force aircraft, including combat types. But it took decades for the WASP to retroactively gain military status in the 1970s. Around the same time the WASP were granted military status, the U.S. military began training women as pilots and other aviators. But it wasn't until 1993 that they gained the right to fly in combat. Tonight, we have with us two author historians who have done extensive research on the topic of women in military aviation. Beverly Weintraub is the author of Wings of Gold, the story of the First Women Naval Aviators. Eileen Bjorkman is the author of Girls Revolt, the story of women who kicked open the door to fly in combat. I very much look forward to hearing them discuss the challenges faced by America's pioneering women military aviators and their fight to create opportunities for future generations. With that, I'd like to now turn it over to the aeronautics curator, Mike Hankins, to introduce tonight's speakers in more detail. Mike?
All right, thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate that. Thank you all for being here. Welcome. And for those watching online, thank you so much for tuning in. We're so happy to have you. I hope you're excited, as I am, to talk with our guests tonight. You both have written some amazing books here, and what's really interesting is, you each come from a little bit different background, you have a little bit different lens, but you're kind of telling a story that both of these books work so well together to tell this larger story. So I want to let you guys do most of the talking here, so let me ask you some questions. Start with the beginning of this story. You mentioned the WASP, Chris, in World War II. What are women doing in terms of military aviation right after World War II in the 40s, 50s, and 60s? Eileen, can you tell us about what the situation was like for them?
Sure, Mike. They actually weren't doing much with military aviation after World War II. The WASP were disbanded actually before the war was even over, and at the end of the war, in 1948, the service chiefs wanted to keep women in the military because they'd served very honorably, and so they passed a law to allow women to stay in the military in 1948. But at the same time, they also passed a law that did not allow, explicitly prohibited women from flying combat aircraft in combat, engaging the enemy in combat, and also from serving on combat ships, which pretty much excluded almost all the Navy ships. So yeah, and there was no law against women just flying military airplanes, though. But the services, by policy, did not want women flying military airplanes, and so they did not allow women to serve in any kind of flying capacity until the 1970s, when things started to crack open a bit. But they had several decades there, and at times they even went backwards. There were like women air traffic controllers for a while, and the Air Force said, nah, we're not going to have any more of them. And so it was almost like 2 steps forward, 1 step back in a lot of cases.
That's fascinating. So Bev, your book focuses kind of on the Navy side of this, and you have a lot of stories in here. You tend to focus on 6 individuals for the most part. And I want to get to as many of them as we can, but the person you focus on the most, understandably so, is Rosemary Mariner. Can you tell us a little bit about her? Who is she? What's her career? And why is she so important?
Right. So in 1972, with Vietnam winding down, the Navy realized they needed people very badly. The reenlistment rate was way down. The war was winding down. The attractiveness of going to sea rather than fighting in the jungle was going to disappear. People expected the Equal Rights Amendment would pass, so these restrictions on women's service. Navy women, as Eileen said, weren't allowed on ships. They weren't allowed in aircraft. There were limits on how many women could earn high rank. A woman was not allowed to be a commanding officer over men. None of these things made the military attractive to women. There was a crisis. They needed people. How to draw women in. So the Navy was about a half a step ahead of the other services in opening opportunities for women with some limits, and one of those opportunities was flight training. So my book focuses on the first 6 women to officially go through U.S. military flight training. The program started in 1973. Captain Rosemary Mariner was the last of the 6. It was a 6 people. They suspended the program to see if it would continue. They eventually decided that yes, it would, but this group of 6 women were the original pioneers, and they were 6 women out of a sea of men. They were isolated. They were on their own, dealing with having to navigate being these pioneers. Rosemary Mariner was the last of the 6. She was the youngest. She was 19 years old when she signed on. She was a student at Purdue University, scrambled to get through her classes in 2.5 years so she could graduate. She was already a certificated flight instructor, 620 hours in her logbook, and she became a driving force in opening more and more opportunities for women. She should have been allowed to fly jets when she completed flight training. She certainly had the grades for it. She had the skills, but women weren't allowed to fly jets. Women weren't allowed to land on an aircraft carrier. Carrier qualification was the defining accomplishment for naval aviators, and the women weren't allowed to do that. Women weren't allowed to go on ships. And with every milestone, she opened the door for women to fly jets, for women to carrier qualify, for women to serve on carriers. And then later, she was a driving force in the fight in Congress to lift the restrictions on women in formal combat. The Navy kind of had this little linguistic trick they did, that women weren't allowed on ships that had a combat mission. So the ship didn't have to be engaged in combat at that time. It just had to be potentially in combat. And that was enough to limit women's opportunities. And she was a driving force in breaking down all those barriers for women.
Yeah. So, and both of you have mentioned that it's kind of in the 70s, particularly that mid-70s moment where this really starts changing. So Eileen, what is it about the 70s? I mean, is it Dark Side of the Moon coming out? Like, what's going on that makes the 70s this key moment of change?
Yeah, I never actually thought about the dark side of the moon. You might have something there, Mike. So I think it was just a lot of things that were coming together. The civil rights movement, women's rights movement had all started in the 60s. And women were... women in the military at that time, even before they opened up aviation, they were getting tired of where they were getting kicked out when they were pregnant. If a woman got married, her husband did not automatically get benefits the way a wife would if she married a military guy. And they were just getting tired of all this kind of stuff, and they started filing lawsuits, and they were winning their lawsuits. One of them actually went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg worked on those cases. And there were several women in the military, especially Jean Holm, general in the Air Force, and she was very instrumental, very vocal about trying to open more doors for women and gain better, more access, equal rights for women within the military. So all of that was going on, and there's Jean Holm, so she was the first female general in the Air Force. And all that was going on at the same time as some of these other things that Bev mentioned, like the end of the draft, which really scared the services. They were concerned about being able to recruit enough people, because even though the draft is just for the Army, it helps the other services as well, because people go, oh, I'm about to get drafted. I think I'll go join the Air Force or the Navy. And so all of the services were very nervous about the impact that was going to have. Military service was very unpopular at that time, of course, the drawdown, with the Vietnam War and everything. And then the ERA. Again, that really scared the service chiefs, because they thought, oh my goodness, they expected it to get ratified. Of course, it didn't, but they thought it would be ratified, and they were very concerned about, they were going to be forced to bring a bunch of women in. And so the attitudes were shifting along with the laws and other things that were going on, and I think it all just kind of came together. I mean, I think it was going to happen eventually, but I think the mid-70s, like you said, was kind of that turning point where everybody started to realize that this is the wave of the future, and we need to start letting women, be pilots and navigators and other things. Interestingly, now the Marines, all of their aircraft were combat, so they didn't actually have women pilots until the law changed. But the Air Force was actually the last of the services, other than the Marines, to finally start training women as pilots. So they were the most resistant, and I have some thoughts on that.
We should mention you are an Air Force veteran.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm Air Force, and I was not a pilot. I was a flight test engineer, but they insisted that all of their pilots were combat pilots. All Air Force pilots are combat pilots, even though they had lots of pilots flying, transport aircraft and refueling and all of those different kinds of things. But they insisted that all of their pilots had to be combat pilots, and also I think there was just some psychology going on there that the Air Force is the only service that their main mission is to fly. Flying is a secondary mission in the other services. And I think that was just a little bit too much for them to, it's like, oh my gosh, if women can fly, well, then it's not really that special, is it, right? So I think there was some of that. But, by 1976, and of course with the academies letting women in and everything, by 1976, they had finally given up and decided that they were going to try training women as pilots as well. So. Yeah.
So Bev, you track these 6 women and some of the ones that were inspired by them and came alongside them throughout the 70s and 80s in their careers, leading up to, before combat exclusion goes away. And you mentioned a minute ago some of the restrictions that they had, some of the limitations that they had. I want to drill down on that a little more. Can you expand on what is the experience like for these women kind of in that 70s and 80s, early 90s period? What is their life looking like in terms of military aviation?
Okay, well, the women that I focused on, they were really most active in building their careers and breaking down barriers in the 70s and 80s. There were restrictions that they knew about. There were other things that came as quite a surprise. So not being allowed to fly jets, not being allowed to land on a carrier, having to basically be expected to go home if you got pregnant. Joellen Osland, who was the first female helo pilot in the U.S. military, discovered that she was not allowed to fly out to a ship to deliver the mail because, well, ships are combat vessels. She couldn't even hover her helicopter over a ship to deliver the mail, which was not something she had really expected. She expected she'd be able to serve with the rest of her squadron. And it just was not allowed. And it's kind of interesting, the push and pull, because the orders came from the top that women are going to have these opportunities. Whether the people down the chain actually went along, some did, some were absolutely 100% supportive and really put their own careers at risk to make sure the women had opportunities, whether it was technically legal or not. And some of them were completely obstructionist and went out of their way to make sure that women would not have opportunities at all. The first female Navy pilot to serve overseas was Jane O'Day, Jane Skiles O'Day, who was the first woman to fly the C-130. Unfortunately, it was a Navy woman who had that honor because Air Force women didn't fly at the time. And she got to her first billet and she was told she's not allowed to use the bathroom because there's no bathroom for women. And it's just the message that sends and the resistance is just astonishing. And these 6 women were completely isolated. They were on their own, by themselves, with no one else to talk to, having to hope that some men would be supportive and help them out, and many of them did, in helping them blaze these trails.
Mm-hmm. So, Eileen, something that you have mentioned and you talk about is that, a lot of historians talk about how this combat exclusion is not fair. Which it makes sense, but you've also argued that it's really not fair to everyone. It's not just unfair to women. Can you unpack kind of what you meant by that?
Yeah, so, like I said, it was unfair to women in the sense that, especially in the Air Force, to reach the highest echelons, at least in those days, this is backed off a little bit, but in those days, you pretty much had to be some kind of a combat pilot. So, and that was what got you promoted, got you up into those higher ranks. And so if women couldn't fly combat aircraft and be in combat, they would forever be excluded from those higher positions. And so if a woman aspired to be, one of the most senior leaders in the Air Force, it was going to be a lot harder. It doesn't mean it was impossible, but it was going to be a lot harder for her than it was for a guy, who was able to, to be in a combat role. So that was the unfair side to the women. The other side, though, is, like I said, it's not fair to anybody. It's not fair to the men. It's not fair to the commanders. Commanders expect that they're going to get the best people. for the job. And typically, especially combat commanders, the fighter pilot in the Air Force is, kind of the top of the food chain, if you will. And, fighter squadron commanders expected to get the top graduates out of pilot training. And the top graduates out of pilot training in the Air Force, they typically go to fighters, bombers, and that sort of a thing. And so you could have a woman who graduated at the top of her class or near the top of her class. She's one of the most qualified people in that class, and yet she's not allowed to go fly a fighter or a bomber. She's sent to fly a transport aircraft. And there's nothing wrong with those other aircraft. Every mission, every aircraft in the Air Force is important. But you're not taking your best people. Your commander is now getting somebody who actually was lower ranked than that woman to go fly that fighter. And so you're not getting the best people into the job. The other issue has to do with employment in combat, because you have many situations, even though combat sounds pretty straightforward, there's a lot of gray area. If you're flying Army troops into Grenada and people are shooting at you, are you in combat if you can't shoot back? The law just talked about engaging in combat. It didn't say anything about actually being shot at. And in fact, a lot of the early women pilots used to say that you're in combat when you can shoot back. Otherwise you're not actually in combat, which I think we all would disagree with that. It was said facetiously. But you had situations where you had commanders on the ground. These are like lieutenant colonels, maybe colonels, who are interpreting the law and making policy decisions, interpreting policy to decide whether women in their squadron can go on a particular mission or not. And this happened again and again, where women were pulled off of missions and men were brought in, sometimes less qualified men were brought in, or perhaps they were on their day off or something. They were brought in to fly these missions because an individual commander said, no, I don't think a woman should be on that mission. And so it wasn't fair to these commanders who had to make these decisions. It wasn't fair to the men who had to come in, and substitute for the women. It made scheduling a nightmare, what's combat, what's not. And so, like I said, it just wasn't fair to anybody. You want to be able to use everybody in your squadron, for every mission. Now, if somebody can't go on a mission because they're not qualified, that's one thing. They haven't had the training or something. But if somebody just can't go on a mission because they're a woman, that's very disruptive, yeah.
Can I jump in a little bit?
Please.
This is an issue that the 6 pioneering women in my book faced because they were not allowed to engage in some of, the very risky business, of being a naval aviator. Landing on a carrier is a risky thing to do. And here are women who do not who do not have those risks. They have the accolades, they have the gold wings, but they're not assuming the same risks, and a lot of the men totally resented it. They said they felt they did not earn the right to call themselves naval aviators, and the women absolutely agreed. They tried time and time again to get permission to be able to do this along with the guys, and the answer was no. Women were not allowed to serve overseas. They only had shore billets. Now, the way it would work was that for the guys, they would alternate overseas and then the shore billets. Well, if the shore billets were taken up by the women, that's less opportunity for the men. That's inherently unfair. The women don't have the opportunity to gain experience for promotions, to gain experience for command because they're not overseas. For the military, they're training these pilots at great public expense, and then they're not allowed to use them. So you've got fully qualified pilots, and they don't let them go out to a ship. So all down the line, it just created really a second tier of second-class citizens that would echo throughout the decades and was a factor in the Tailhook scandal, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later on.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and do this now. I mean, knowing that this is an all-ages audience, but I think you make a good point, and both of you talk about this incident extensively in your book because it is so important. It's hard to talk about this history without talking about the Tailhook scandal of 1991. So could you briefly explain for us what happened, but also why was that such an important event for this broader story? Right,
so Tailhook refers to landing on an aircraft carrier. A Navy pilot who does 10 carrier landings is known as a tailhooker. The Tailhook Association was an independent organization, but very closely affiliated with the Navy and the Marine Corps. They had this annual conference every year. It was known for drunken debauchery. The guys would get together and have a wild time. This particular year, I believe it was 1991, when the push to allow women to fly in combat was really heating up. And there was an awful lot of resistance from a lot of guys who, as Eileen said, if women can do it, then that's not such a special thing anymore. At a panel discussion of admirals, a female aviator got up and asked when women are going to be allowed to fly in combat. And it was met by jeers and catcalls and hoots from the junior officers, and the admirals on the dais did nothing to stop it, which gave tacit permission to just treat these women abominably. And for the rest of the conference, it turned ugly, it was violent. Women were sexually assaulted, they were bitten, they were stripped down, and it wasn't just Navy people. Anybody who happened to walk off the elevator was attacked over a period of days. There were several investigations that kind of went nowhere. There was stonewalling. There were dozens of victims. I think many of them never came forward and just tried to disappear. Several admirals were eventually demoted, and some other people were reprimanded. But it was a black eye. There was one helo pilot who did go public because she was attacked by members of her own squadron, and nobody wanted to do anything. And she went to the press and was ostracized for it, and had to leave her squadron. The perpetrators, nothing happened to, but she was blamed. And the undercurrent of this was, you have second-class citizens. They are not assuming the risks. Why should they deserve to be able to perform this service?
So how did that elevate this discussion into the public arena and kind of draw attention to this broader issue?
So let's back up just a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because in the wake of Desert Storm, was when the combat exclusion law was repealed. So it was repealed actually in April. Well, I guess it was later that summer because it had to go through both the House and the Senate. So, and that was another battle. So, but it was repealed in 1991. But that didn't immediately force the services to start training women for combat, because the policy still existed. Just because the law's gone doesn't mean the services are going to change their policies. And so that started this whole nother battle, and there was actually a presidential commission that was put in place, and they were supposed to study this whole issue and then recommend whether or not things were going to open up. So, and in 1992, in November of 1992, the commission presented its findings, and they recommended actually that combat remain closed. And what changed, though, was there was two things. One, Bill Clinton got elected, and it was the Bush administration that didn't want to do the change. So that happened, and I think Tailhook, even though Tailhook, I think it was going to happen sooner or later, but Tailhook was starting to. There was another investigation that was done, and the report was about to come out, and it was bad, because this report, the real report, really dug in and really found out what really happened, and it was going to be really bad. And so all of a sudden, and it's not clear if these two events are totally connected, but all of a sudden the Navy started going, we think we ought to let women fly in combat aircraft. And there were some people that thought, they're only doing that because this report's about to come out, and it's really, really bad, and they're trying to deflect attention away from that. So I think, again, it was one of these things that was going to happen eventually. I think Tailhook certainly helped to push it along more quickly than perhaps would have happened if it had not happened. So.
Right. Now, you mentioned Desert Storm. I wanted to ask you about this because you write a lot, both of you write a lot about Desert Storm in your books. I know you've written elsewhere about Desert Storm as well. Tell us about the role women played in Desert Storm in terms of military aviation, the type of roles they were doing there. This is still flying under the combat exclusion law, but it kind of gets back to what you were saying earlier about what is the definition of combat, and that war kind of brought that issue to light. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so Desert Storm, for those of you who are old enough to remember, there was a several-month buildup, before we actually had full-blown combat operations. It was very much a logistics war. We had very little basing in the Middle East, and so had to take all of that over. Well, that all went over on transport aircraft. The fighters that went over had to be refueled. Well, where are all the women? They're in the transports and the tankers, and you also had a lot of women who were in the reserves, and the reserves were activated. And so you had your small town, they're saying goodbye to their reservists. They're not saying goodbye just to Jimmy. They're also saying goodbye to Susie. And so all of a sudden the American public started to realize that, oh my gosh, women are at war, and women are going into combat areas, and 13 of them died. There were quite a few casualties. They realized that women were being put in harm's way, that these laws were not keeping women safe. They were just causing problems, and so it was, to me, Desert Storm was the real precipitating point of everything. So. But there were also some things that happened in Desert Storm that I think then led to what happened at Tailhook as well. So yeah, so it was all this kind of, everything was sort of swirling around here. So I think, it's hard to talk about any one of them individually, but Desert Storm was definitely the precipitating event that made people realize that these laws need to go. So.
Yeah, that's the tough work of a historian, right? To try to untangle all these threads when they're all happening at the same time. I think both of you have done a really good job of diving into that. And one of the other things that's kind of happening around that same time, and you pick up on this, Bev, a lot in your book, is the story of Kara Hultgreen and her tragic death, but also her career leading up to that. Can you tell us a little bit about her and why she plays an important role here?
Right. So Kara Hultgreen was the first female Navy pilot to qualify for combat duty. She was an F-14 pilot. And she, like this primary 6 women in my book, really had to battle to get what for a man would have been his due, had to perform twice as well as any guy. If she messed up, it wasn't just her mistake. It was, it's all the women who can't do this. There were 2 carriers that women were allowed to serve on. One was the Abraham Lincoln, which was quickly renamed the Babraham Lincoln. The other was the Dwight D. Eisenhower, otherwise known as the Ike, and you can kind of guess what that was nicknamed. So this was kind of the environment that these women were functioning in. And, there were not a lot of them on the carrier, but that really didn't make a difference. Kara Hultgreen was brash, was confident, like any fighter pilot is going to be. And everybody knew that the first time a woman died, all hell was going to break loose. And she was coming in for a landing. She was on approach. Something happened with the aircraft. Her backseater ejected, and she didn't make it out of the plane. And she was killed. And the tradition was that, when a pilot is dead, you do not badmouth them. They are respected. As soon as she went in the water, the local press started getting these anonymous tips. She was a terrible pilot. She was at the bottom of her class, which was not the case. She was not qualified. She was rushed through training. She should not have been there. Her training records, which were supposed to be confidential, were leaked. There had been multiple other F-14 crashes. It was not an easy airplane to fly, and I'm not a military pilot. I don't have personal experience with this, but from everything I've read, the F-14 was a bit squirrely. There were men who crashed and died in F-14s. None of them were dragged through the mud. She was. It probably didn't help that the Navy also spent a huge amount of money to recover the aircraft, and she was given a burial at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, which the men also were not. So was she privileged? Was she a terrible pilot who needed extra help? The chatter ran the gamut, but this was unprecedented. Male pilots were never subjected to this kind of scrutiny, and it was only her. Rosemary Mariner called it the smearing of Kara.
So as we move forward into this story, so Eileen, tell us about after combat exclusion goes away and women do start flying, they're flying combat missions, they're flying fighter jets, anything you can imagine. What is their experience like as we go into the late 90s and now into the 21st century? What is the typical experience, do you think, or is there a typical experience?
Well, from what I've seen, there's actually getting to be quite a few, women fighter pilots now, and especially in the Air Force. The numbers are still fairly small. So, but some of the communities are getting large numbers. I was quite surprised the F-15E and the A-10 communities. Of course, the A-10's starting to go away, so yeah. But both of those communities seem to have a lot of women in them. So I was at a panel that we did at Oshkosh last year, celebrating the 30 years of women in combat aircraft, and almost all of the women that we had brought in, whether they were retired or still on active duty, were A-10 pilots. And it's not like we went out looking for A-10 pilots. It's just that's who showed up, So I think they're doing very well in some of the communities. They're accepted. They're getting into command jobs and that sort of a thing. So from what I can see, the air superiority community, like the F-15. The F-15 air superiority aircraft, the F-22, seems like they're still lagging a little bit. So there's small numbers of women. I've talked with some of the women who are in those weapon systems, and they're often still the only woman in their squadron in those kinds of units. Sometimes even the only woman pilot in the wing. So we still have a ways to go, but. I think the early women definitely had some challenges. They were like the only woman in their squadron, having to deal with that, still having to deal with a lot of men who didn't necessarily want them there. But for young women coming in today, the young men and the leaders that are out there, women are normal in their squadrons now. So they've never known a time when women weren't in those squadrons. I'm not saying they don't still have some challenges, but I think things are much better than they used to be. And one of the things that I really liked was a few years ago, y'all might remember, the F-35 demonstration pilot was Captain then Major Kristen Bayo-Wolf. And when she became the demonstration pilot for the F-35, there was an interview with her, and it wasn't until the very end of the interview that they said, by the way, you're the first woman demonstration pilot for the F-35. How does that feel? It was like buried at the very bottom. It wasn't the headline. It was just sort of buried at the bottom. And then this next go around, they have the new F-35 demonstration pilot that was announced, I think about a year ago now. It's another woman. And nobody even mentioned her gender at all. So I think we've made a lot of progress that we now don't just have women in these jobs. They're actually out in doing demonstrations. And when little girls see that, and they see a woman flying that airplane and getting out of that airplane at the end of the air show, that really means something. Seeing yourself, being able to see yourself in that job is so important.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. That's fascinating. One of the things I definitely want to ask both of you about as well is just the process of putting a book like this together and like how you do this research, and to kind of give us some behind the scenes. And like I said, you both have a very different perspective in putting this story together. So Bev, starting with you, coming from your background more on the journalism side, how did you go about, well, first, why? What drew you to this story in the first place? And then how did you find the sources for putting a book like this together?
Okay, so this story sort of found me because, I'm a journalist by trade. I'm also a private pilot. And one of my former colleagues from the New York Daily News worked in the opinion section of the Washington Post. So when something happens about women in airplanes, I'll get an email, hey, do you want to write something? When Captain Mariner passed away in 2019, the Navy did the first all-women missing man flyover at her funeral, and this got huge headlines. So I got an email, hey, would you write something? So I did. And a couple of months later, I had an email from an editor at Lyons Press saying, we saw the piece, we think this could make an interesting book, what do you think? So then the question became, should it be a book about one person or should it be about the six? And just looking at the stories, the trajectories of these six women who came from different backgrounds, had different experiences, and various aspects of their life really illustrated the larger stories of what was going on in the military and the country at that time. That absolutely seemed like the way to go. it was astonishing to me how much had been written about these women at the time, because they were completely forgotten. But there was so much press coverage of them when the program started, and with every milestone. They were in newspapers, they were on TV game shows, they were on the covers of magazines, they were on the cover of Parade. One of them was one of Glamour magazine's top 10 working women of 1982. So finding the story, you know, there are archives, you know, putting the timelines together was pretty straightforward. You know, there was just so much information, and then it was a question of reaching out to the families and, you know, finding out would they want to talk to this stranger who wants to write about their lives. And it just astonished me that, yeah, they said yes. And I had put out a query on a listserv, I think there was a women military speakers organization, and they sent out my query, and a couple of the women responded, including one who was a retired captain named Mary Louise Griffin, who was in the second group of Navy pilots, and she's a centerpiece of the women military aviator community. And I think she must have vouched for me, because otherwise why would everybody say, sure, we'll talk to this stranger. So then talking to the women, 4 of them were still alive when I was researching the book. Sadly, 2 of them passed away in 2022, but 4 of them were alive. Talking to them, talking to their families, talking to people who served with them, and really putting the meat on the bones of the story, and figuring out, like, if Rosemary Mariner is widely described as an inspiring leader, well, what does that mean exactly? What difference does it make that she was the first woman to command an aviation squadron? What difference did it mean to the people who were serving with her to have a female CO and then that particular woman? What difference did that make? And I was also fortunate that Tammy Jo Schultz, who I think spoke here, was in her squadron. And she spent an hour and a half on the phone talking to me about what a difference that had made. And that really fleshed out the story and really, you know, put life to it. You could really see what influence these women had on the people coming up behind them and how they opened doors. The other thing that was hugely helpful, I started writing this book just about the time COVID started, and all the archives were closed. I had tickets to go to Pensacola in March of 2020 to go to the Naval Aviation Museum. Well, that clearly wasn't happening, but all the museums and the universities, there were skeleton staffs, and those archivists and curators were willing to do my legwork for me, so I am eternally grateful to them, because I never would have been able to get the book done without everybody's help.
Well, I can confirm curators are research nerds, and we love having an excuse to dig through stuff. Eileen, tell us a little bit about your process in writing this, but also, this is a 2-part question, because you have a very different perspective here. You know, Air Force colonel, flight test engineer with hundreds of hours, and F-4 Phantoms and F-16s and all kinds of other things. So, 1, how was your research process in writing this book? And 2, what is a flight test engineer, and what was your career like?
Yeah, so I actually became a flight test engineer because of the combat exclusion law. My eyes weren't good enough to go to pilot training, and I thought about being a navigator, but I knew no matter how good I do, I wouldn't be able to fly in fighters, which is what I wanted to do. And then I learned that I could be a flight test engineer, fly in the back seat, you know, you help run test cards, or you're sitting on the ground in a control room, think NASA, you know, kind of running the mission, if you will, making real-time decisions about whether a test point is good, you know, that sort of a thing. So, and as a flight test engineer, I could fly in so-called combat aircraft because they were test airplanes. And so here I am actually on a F-4 that I flew in at Edwards. And if you look very closely, you can see that my name's actually on the rear cockpit. So yeah, but yeah, so I wanted to do that. And so I was one of a handful of women who were actually flying in, you know, fighter kinds of aircraft, combat kinds of aircraft back in the 80s. And I knew there was no reason that, you know, women shouldn't be flying in the front seat either. And I was a big advocate of that. And I knew a lot of women who wanted to do that. I knew a lot of the early women test pilots, Jackie Parker and Eileen Collins, who I think is going to be speaking here. And I just knew that there was no reason for this. And so I had a front row seat to this whole thing. And I knew who all the key players were. I kind of knew the general timeline. I knew what had happened. I knew about the Presidential Commission. And so I started writing from that perspective as, you know, here's what I think happened, But then, of course, I had to go dig into the archives and find out what really happened. And in some cases, I wasn't quite right, as you might imagine. I was a captain, and as opposed to, being up in policy level and really understanding what was going on. So I dug into a lot of archives. I went to the Air Force Historical Research Agency. I got a wealth of stuff from there, so especially some of the things that were happening leading up to the actual opening and the things that were going on with General McPeak and everything. Mostly just I interviewed people, though. I interviewed people who were there, people who were, whether it was men or women. So I was interviewing lots of people who were actually involved in what was going on. Women Military Aviators, it's an association which I'll have to admit I'm the president of that right now, so I may be a little bit biased. But they were very, very helpful in getting me in contact with women to interview who'd had different kinds of experiences. I knew some of the women, and I was just able to contact them directly, but they were very helpful. And especially things started out as Desert Storm, as you mentioned. I actually wrote a short article about the women of Desert Storm. And a lot of those women later on became I interviewed them again to get other experiences from them to be able to include them in the book. So yeah, a lot of it was my own experiences, the interviewing, and then digging into the archives. Yeah,
that's fascinating. I want to get some questions from the audience here in a minute. So as you start thinking of your questions, and for those of you online, you can drop your questions in the chat. But as you're thinking of questions, before we do that, I have one more question for both of you, which is, if you could summarize, what are you hoping that the readers take away from this book? Why do you think this story is so relevant for us today, right now?
I mean, women have come a long way. They are still not, it's still somewhat of a rarity. Not as much as it has been, but I mean, for example, the Navy now has its first ever female Blue Angels demonstration pilot. That was last year. Why it took so long, I don't know, but there's still, these firsts are still being logged, and unfortunately, there is still pushback. Women still are encountering roadblocks. There is still resistance, and there's still some awful stuff that goes on. There was a murder at Fort Hood a couple of years ago. A woman had been sexually harassed. She reported it to her commander. Nothing happened. She ended up dead. So these things, unfortunately, are still going on, and what I would hope that readers would take away from this, especially women who are encountering some of these obstacles, is that they're not the first ones, they're not the only ones. This has happened before. People have overcome, people have persevered, and they're not alone, and there are solutions out there. There are people who can help, people who know how to help, and it's just that they're not alone.
Yeah, I would say a similar thing. I actually have two things I want to mention. So yeah, the first is just the continued lack of representation of women in aviation in many parts of aviation. There's two things I always point to. Only about 5% of airline pilots in the United States are women still. Why is that? Only 20% of the officers in the Air Force are women. How come 20% of the pilots in the Air Force aren't women? I wouldn't necessarily expect it to be exactly that, but you'd think it would be a lot closer than the 6% that we have now. So clearly there's still some barriers there. I think it's still a lot of social stuff. The laws have changed, but there's still a lot of social stuff that needs catching up. So I think being aware of what's happened in the past and not forgetting about that is important. And the other point I want to make is all these women who fought to kick open the door, they didn't benefit from that. They were too old by the time the law changed. They never got to fly in combat aircraft. There were a few of the younger ones who were able to make that transition, but these women did this because they were fighting for the next generation. And you always have to think about that sometimes when you're fighting for a cause, it's not going to help you, but it's going to help your son or your daughter, or maybe even just the kid down the street. It's that next generation that we have to think about, not just ourselves.
Absolutely. I want to thank you both for writing these books. They've been very useful to me and many of the historians that I know. And I want to turn now to all y'all. So if you have a question, I think the way it works is that you scan this QR code and you can put your questions in, and they will show up on this little thing that I have. And for those of you online, you can do the same thing, and your questions should come through here. So we've got already a flood of questions, which is great. Keep them coming. We'll try to get through as many as we can here. Number one comes from Amanda. What has been your greatest challenge and greatest accomplishment as a woman in a male-dominated field, and how has that led to the next generation of women aviators having an easier step up?
So I actually always talk about being a flight test engineer. I mean, I was one of only a handful of women flight test engineers. I was it used to be that the Air Force with the test squadrons, most of the test squadron commanders were pilots, you know. And then as I started getting into that age where I could possibly be a commander, they started letting flight test engineers become squadron commanders. And I was one of the early ones that was selected, so. And I don't think it had anything to do with being a woman. You know, I was just in the right place at the right time, which is how a lot of that stuff works. You know, I did have that feeling that I have to do good, right? Like we were saying, you know, if a woman screws up, then she's going to screw it up for all the women behind her. So I had that sense that I had to do a really good job. But I think more importantly, not just for, you know, keeping that door open for other women, I kept that door open for all flight test engineers, because now there are lots of test squadrons in the Air Force that there's always a flight test engineer in charge of them, and there's this better defined career path that didn't exist when I was a young flight test engineer. So I think we've made the test community stronger, and, you know, by doing that, and I'm, you know, very proud of having been a part of that. So.
That's great. This question's from Laura. Thank you, Laura. What do you think was the biggest day-to-day challenge for the first female aviators?
I think there were a number of things. First of all, just getting through flight training, which is incredibly difficult. I mean, some of these women had some flight experience, some of them had none. So they were starting out cold, as were many of the men. The women were also had these publicity duties. The Navy simultaneously didn't necessarily want them there, but really wanted to have pictures of them everywhere. So there were always photographers and reporters following them around. They had to pose for pictures, they had to go on TV, in addition to studying to master the next level of flight training. The guys didn't quite have to do that. So that was additional pressure. They also knew that if they messed up and the program was canceled, that was going to be it. So they had these enormous pressures in addition to just being there and getting through and becoming the best pilots they absolutely could. There were a couple of like odd things that happened to them unexpectedly. You know, we're going to send a letter. Can we land on a carrier? No, you can't. And by the way, we're taking it away from a bunch of the guys as well. So there were just many opportunities for resentment to build. On the other hand, there were also help from unexpected places, men who were willing to go out on a limb to get them opportunities. And eventually, four of the 6 women retired as captains, so they made their careers in the military, which nobody, I think, really expected them to do. And as they moved up, they were able to open the doors, as Eileen said, for the women coming up behind them, but also for the men, making sure that everybody had equal opportunity.
Yeah. There's a great question here from Susan. It's kind of a question that I wanted to ask as well, so thank you. Have drones or unpiloted aircraft affected women in aviation? How or how not?
I have not seen any impact. There are many women flying, you know, remotely piloted aircraft. Yeah, I'm trying to think of the official term there. And there's many women acting as sensor operators and doing other things. So I don't think it's going to have a big impact. So I mean, it's impacting them the same way it impacts the men. So yeah. So.
Yeah. Here's a question from Kristen. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Thank you for being here, Kristen. It is a very real feeling that women are under a microscope. Everything is magnified, especially mistakes. What advice do you have for women under those microscopes, and what advice for those that look through the microscope?
Well, there's a saying that, like, and Bev mentioned this, for a woman to succeed, she has to be twice as good as the man. Well, fortunately, that's not hard, so, but.
Got him.
But in all seriousness, you know, I think that, you know, that's a social thing, that's a cultural thing, and I think that's unfortunately going to be around for a while. That sense that, oh, if I mess this up, you know, somebody's gonna going to think it's because I'm a woman and I'm going to mess it up for other women. But I also think that that's starting to change because, I mean, there are a lot of career fields now that we are starting to see large percentages of women in. And I saw something that said once you hit about 20%, that sort of starts to go away, that women are just accepted in that career field. And if a woman messes up, it's not seen as any different than a man messes up, because the men mess up just as, if you look at rates of messing up, it's about the same. It's equal opportunity. And I think that's where, we need to be is, okay, a woman messed up. Okay, well, so, so do guys, and so.
Can confirm.
Yeah, and you just start to see it treated that way. And so I guess that would be my thing is, don't worry about messing up. I think I worried too much about messing up, and so then I tried to overachieve, and that's not a good place to be either. Be yourself and do the best you can, and if you make a mistake, admit it. So.
Yeah, I'd like to pass along a little bit of advice. In Rosemary Mariner's first billet, her commanding officer was the first African-American CO at Naval Air Station Oceana, and he saw parallels between what the black service members had to do when they integrated the military and what the women were facing. So he became her mentor, and the advice he gave her was find a mentor, network, find your people, reach out and document everything, just in case. Be confident, be the best you can, but, just kind of keep track and watch out and watch your back and find people who will watch your back and you'll watch theirs.
That's a great point, and that's something that I think comes out really strongly in both of these books is that importance of mentorship. And that's definitely a theme that you've hit on here, and so I'm glad you said that. Thank you. That's really important, kind of across the board. Kind of building on some of that, there's a question from online that says, what barriers do you think military women aviators have to overcome today?
So I mentioned this earlier, the laws have all changed, but I think there's still some social barriers out there. Certainly the policies related to pregnancy, are starting to get better. Policies, being able to fly while pregnant. I mean, some of those things are definitely moving in the right direction. But I think there's still, a lot of issues with equipment. And this is one of those things, when I was flying in F4s, 40 years ago, none of the equipment fit me right. Well, then none of the equipment doesn't fit the women now right, And there's a lot of issues, as somebody mentioned, going to the bathroom, I mean, there's various things that impact women differently than they do men. And so I think the services still have a ways to go in solving some of those problems. So, but like I said, it's different kinds of issues, but I think if we can get past some of those kinds of things and get past some of these social issues of, I think there's this perception that you can't be a mom and be a fighter pilot, and you can. You can be a dad and be a fighter pilot. So so getting past that, I think, is what will help us to get more of a balance that says, maybe it's not 20%, but maybe 15 or 16% of female of our Air Force pilots in the future will be women. So.
It was kind of an interesting side conversation when Amanda Lee made her Blue Angels debut, about 50 women from Women Military Aviators, and I went out to California to see her debut, and at that air show, the air boss pulled aside a couple of the women in my book and asked for help because they're getting a lot of women who start, but they don't stay. They have a huge retention problem, and they're not entirely sure what the issue is, with women I get who are in their mid to late 20s and early 30s to try to get them to stay, but they're not. And there seem to be some really large unanswered questions there as to what the problem is.
We have time for one more question, and I actually want to combine a few because there's a lot of people asking about this, which is, what advice would you have if there's someone, whether it's a younger woman that wants to become a pilot or an aviator, or a family member like a mother or someone else that wants to support someone in their family who wants to become an aviator, what advice would you have for them?
Well, there's a couple of things that I'm going to throw out there, and then you've probably got a couple ideas, Bev. So I always steer people to Civil Air Patrol. is a great way, 12 and older kids to get involved, and I think they have some programs for younger kids as well. Also, Experimental Aircraft Association, they have their Young Eagle program, and they have all kinds of programs for kids to learn to fly, learn how to build airplanes, workshops, that kind of thing. So I would strongly recommend jumping on those websites and learning about what's available there. So.
Or much more low-tech, just go out to your local airport. There are small airports all over the country. Many of them have flight schools. Many of them have discovery flights where you're ostensibly the passenger, but you know what, they'll let you fly a little bit because honestly, the airplane just kind of wants to fly itself. Just hang around, look at the airplanes, and just ask questions. Find pilots and ask questions. Ask lots of questions.
And Microsoft Flight Simulator. So.
Microsoft Flight Simulator.
Who doesn't love Microsoft Flight Sim? Well, I think that is about all the time we have. So I need to tell you about a few things before we head out. I want to thank you all for being here, first of all, and for those of you listening online. So glad you're here. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our ASL interpreter, Nicole Pratt. We have another one of these lectures coming up. Our next Aviation Adventure lecture, Women Take Flight, Stories from the U.S. Coast Guard, is going to be back here in this space on October 10th. And I want to say a huge thank you to GE Aerospace for their generous support of this series of lectures. And you can find more of these programs on the events page of the Air and Space Museum website. And of course, please join me in thanking our guests, Eileen and Bev. They will both be here signing these books for you tonight, so please come visit them and join me in thanking them. Thank you so much. All right, thank you all. We'll see you next time.